What if I told you there's a commander that spreads radiation across the entire table, forces your opponents to mill cards every turn, and then turns all of that milling into a massive amount of +1/+1 counters? The Wise Mothman. For 4 mana in Sultai colors, we get a 3/3 flying insect mutant that, just like me, looks like he never blinks. The first thing Mothman does is introduce one of the most unique mechanics from the Fallout set: red counters. Whenever our commander enters a battlefield or attacks, every player will get 1 red counter. And before we go any further, let me quickly explain how these red counters actually work, because there are a couple of important little details that matter a lot in this deck. At the beginning of every player's first main phase, if they have any amount of red counters, they have to mill that many cards. Then for every non-land card milled this way, they will lose 1 life and 1 red counter. Now the important detail here is that players don't automatically lose all of their red counters at once. Let's say someone has 5 red counters, meaning they will have to mill 5 cards. But the chances are that only 3 of those cards will be non-land cards, which means they will only lose 3 life and 3 of their red counters. But they'll still be left with 2 red counters remaining, which will force them to mill again on their next turn. So instead of just being a one-time trigger, red counters often stick around and create multiple instances of milling over the course of several turns. And that's exactly what we want because of Mothman's second ability. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, we get to put a +1/+1 counter of each up to X target different creatures. X being the amount of non-land cards milled. Now that wording might sound a little confusing at first, but what it actually means is this. If for example 4 non-land cards are milled for any reason whatsoever, we get to distribute 4 +1/+1 counters amongst different creatures. And because red counters trigger during every player's turn, we can easily get up to 4 triggers per turn cycle out of Mothman's second ability from just the red counters alone. So without doing anything else, Mothman can easily turn all of the table's radiation into a massive board of +1/+1 counters and trigger a ton of synergies while doing it. Now with all of that in mind, it's probably no surprise that the Wise Mothman is an extremely popular commander, currently sitting at the top of the charts over on EDH rack. And that's simply because the amount of synergies this little insect enables is honestly kinda ridiculous. You can take this deck in many different directions and all of them will work. You can just stack a ton of counters on the Wise Mothman and win through commander damage with your massive flying insect. You can lean more heavily into a mill strategy and try to deck your opponents out. You can build around the red counters as a damage engine, or you could even go all in on the +1/+1 counter synergies. But honestly, the real power of the Mothman is that he enables you to combine all of those strategies into one single cohesive game plan. While normally it's better for a deck to just focus on one single strategy, our Mothman does act as some sort of a Swiss army knife, connecting multiple different archetypes and actually making them work together. And that is exactly what we're going to do in this build. For this deck, I did decide to go budgetless so I could showcase the full potential of our radioactive mod. But throughout the video, I will be mentioning a couple of budget alternatives so you can change the deck depending on how much you want to spend on it. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it and pointing out all of the synergies. This video is divided up into 7 categories: our mill package, the +1/+1 counter synergies, card draw, support, acceleration, protection and interaction, and the lands. And let's get started by diving into our mill package. While this isn't a dedicated mill deck by any means, we do want to trigger our Mothman's ability as often as we can. These cards will help us create as many different mill instances as possible so we can keep stacking counters across our entire board. Altar of the Brute, probably one of the most potent mill cards in existence. For just 1 mana, you get an artifact that whenever any permanent enters the battlefield under your control will make each opponent mill 1 1 card. And this effect will trigger of just about anything. Whenever we play a land, cast our commander, create any sort of tokens, or even of something simple as just playing a mana rock, which will provide us with a really consistent stream of milling that will translate into a ton of +1/+1 counters from Mothman's second ability. And especially since all of the milling will happen in separate different instances, we can even use its effect to stack a ton of counters on a single creature. For example, our Mothman himself, meaning we can turn him into a massive flying creature with a huge amount of power and just win the game on commander damage. This simple card also sets up an incredible amount of near infinite value loops I will be showcasing later in the video. And a card with a really similar effect is Ruin Crab. Instead of making each opponent mill 1 card whenever any permanent enters, each opponent will have to mill 3 cards whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, which will result in a massive total of 9 cards being milled whenever we play a land, and we will get a massive amount of counters of that from our Mothman. And this effect also has an incredible synergy with all of the fetch lands we are playing, because you will both get a trigger of this card whenever you play a fetch land and whenever you crack a fetch land, resulting in a total of 18 cards being milled, which is pretty nuts. Mindcrank, one of the most popular mill cards out there. Whenever any opponent loses life for any reason, they will have to mill that many cards. And this effect by itself over the course of a game will already provide you with a really consistent stream of milling. Opponents swinging at each other, any sort of life cost card like a Sign in Blood being played. It will even trigger if they pay 3 life to make their MDFC land enter the battlefield untapped, and Mindcrank will even give you triggers of the life loss of red counters. And of course, once we do have a huge amount of counters on our Mothman or any of our creatures and they do connect for combat damage, our Mindcrank will be doing a huge amount of milling, which then in turn will grow our board even more with all of the counters that we'll be getting of the milling thanks to our commander. And like most commander players know, Mindcrank does enable some really spicy combos, but more about those later. Mesmeric Orb. Whenever any permanent gets untapped, its controller will have to mill 1 card. The amount of milling this simple card will be doing is just insane. It will give you a huge amount of triggers whenever any player starts their turn and untaps all of their lands, creatures and mana rocks. And a really cool thing is that all of the milling will be happening in separate instances. So let's say you have your Wise Mothman on the field and you pass the turn to an opponent. They then untap 10 permanents during their untap step, meaning they will have to mill 10 cards to Mesmeric Orb's effect. Let's say 7 out of 10 are then non-land cards. You will then get the ability with Mothman to put 7 counters on a single creature, which you can then use to turn your little insect commander into a full-grown Mothra, easily enabling you when it's your turn again to just take an opponent out of the game on commander damage. Deep Muck Desperado, the beefed up version of our Ruin Crab, which instead of making each opponent mill 3 cards on landfall will trigger whenever you commit a crime, meaning you have to target either your opponents, any permanent they control, or anything in their graveyard. And committing crimes in this deck is an incredibly easy thing to do. Because our Mothman doesn't state that we have to put the counters on a creature we control, we can actually choose to put a counter on an opposing creature, meaning that we do target it with an ability and we will get a crime trigger of it. Let's say we just cast our Wise Mothman and every opponent has a red counter. We can then just pass the turn and they will have to mill of the red counters, which will give us the ability to put +1/+1 counters with Mothman. We can then just put 1 of those counters on an opposing creature and we will get a Desperado trigger out of it, making our opponents mill even more cards and giving us even more counters in return. And thanks to the milling of our red counters happening during each opponent's turn, we can easily get up to 4 triggers out of this card's effect per turn cycle, resulting in a total extra of 36 cards being milled by your opponents per cycle, and a massive amount of counters we can distribute. Memory Erosion, a 3-mana enchantment I like to view as some sort of a mill stacks piece, because whenever any opponent casts a spell with this on the battlefield, they will have to mill 2 cards. For the low cost of 3 mana, this card will cause an incredible amount of milling over the course of the game. Just imagine having this card on the battlefield against any sort of storm player. When they do decide to go for a big storm turn, either their library will just be empty, or you will end up with like 30 counters on your Mothman and take them out of the game that way. Psychic Corrosion, another 3 mana artifact that whenever we draw a card will make each opponent mill 2 cards. Now baseline, this card will always trigger from the card we draw during our draw step, but as you will see later, with the massive amount of draw engines we are playing, the amount of milling this card will do is just ridiculous, and it can function as a mill win condition all on itself. You'll see what I'm talking about once we get to the card draw section. Undead Alchemist, a 4 mana zombie creature that whenever any creature card is put into a graveyard from an opponent's library will exile it and will generate us a 2/2 zombie token. Now the biggest weakness of mill decks is that you are fueling your opponent's graveyards and you are actually giving them a benefit by milling them. If you for example are playing against a reanimation player and you do mill their Elesh Norn, they will tank you on a later turn once they can reanimate it. But this card's simple effect totally solves that problem by exiling any milled creature. They can't even cast their Entomb to put something big in their graveyard anymore because it will just get exiled and we will even get a zombie of it. On top of solving this deck's biggest weakness, it will also generate us a massive army of zombie tokens with all of the milling we'll be doing, which we can start buffing up with all of the +1/+1 counters of our Mothman. This card also has an incredible synergy with Altar of the Brut, because whenever we have both cards on the battlefield we can just mill our opponents. If any creatures get milled, we will get a zombie entering the battlefield. This in turn will then trigger your Altar of the Brut, causing our opponents to mill even more cards. And if any creatures do get milled this way, you will get more zombies and more mill triggers. Now while it's not an infinite combo by any means, because once your opponents don't mill any creature cards the loop just stops, it will generate you a huge amount of value. Another nice little ability on this card is that whenever any zombie deals combat damage to an opponent, you do get to prevent that damage and they instead have to mill that many cards, just fueling his own zombie generation ability and giving us even more counters with our Mothman. The Water Crystal, a 4 mana legendary artifact that will reduce the cost of any blue spell we cast by 1 generic mana, which I suppose is quite nice, but the main reason it's included is its second effect, which goes absolutely nuts with all of the previous cards. If an opponent would mill 1 or more cards, they have to mill that many +4 instead. And as you've seen in this deck, we are trying to get as many separate instances of small amounts of mill as possible, and this effect will apply to all of those instances. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how ridiculous this card is. Whenever any permanent enters a battlefield with an Altar of the Brut, each opponent will have to mill 5 cards per permanent that enters. Your opponents will have to mill 6 cards per spell they cast with a Memory Erosion. Whenever we now draw a card with a Psychic Erosion on the battlefield, all of our opponents will have to mill 6 cards. If your opponents have to mill 2 the red counters, they now will have to mill that many cards +4. And my favorite interaction is combining this card with a Mesmeric Orb, because now whenever any opponent untaps a permanent, they will have to mill 5 cards per permanent they untap. So whenever you do have both cards on the battlefield and you pass a turn to an opponent, if they for example untap 15 permanents, they will now have to mill a total of 75 cards, just winning you the game on the spot. And while the effect of Mesmeric Orb also applies to ourselves, the increased milling of the Water Crystal only applies to our opponents. And these examples make the Water Crystal into one of the craziest cards in the entire deck, allowing you to convert all of your small instances of milling into an actual game win. Next up, we have our +1/+1 Counter Synergies. Once our mill engine is online and we can start stacking an insane amount of counters on our creatures thanks to our Mothman, these are the cards that will turn those counters into even more value. Hardened Scales. Yeah, obviously it's included, it's just the most efficient efficient +1/+1 counter based card out there. For just 1 mana we get an enchantment that whenever we would put any amount of +1/+1 counters on a creature, we get to put that many +1 instead. And due to the way of how the Wise Mothman's ability is worded, we'll always be putting counters on our creatures in separate instances of 1 counter. And in this deck, a Hardened Scales will just double our entire counter output, which will just double the speed we are able to grow our Mothman or any other creature on the board and turn them into a lethal force. And a card with a really similar effect is Winding Constructor, a 2-mana creature that will give us additional counters whenever we put any on a creature or an artifact, and on top of that it will also double the amount of counters we put on ourselves as a player, which will result in us getting double the red counters of our own Mothman. And honestly, that's a good thing for us because it will mean that more cards are being milled by ourselves and we will get more counters of our Mothman because of that. With the huge amount of recursion we are playing in this deck, we will be able to get those milled cards back anyways. Basking Broodscale, a 2-mana creature that whenever it receives any amount of +1/+1 counters will generate us a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token we can sacrifice to add 1 colorless mana to our mana pool. Now just that ability in itself already sets up for some insane mana acceleration when combined with our Mothman, because whenever any non-land card now gets milled, we will be able to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and we will be getting access to an insane amount of colorless mana we can use to cast any of our big spells in the deck. And this card also synergizes in a similar fashion with Altar of the Brood as our Undead Alchemist. Whenever any card gets milled, we will get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. The Eldrazi spawn token will then enter. This will trigger your Altar of the Brood. More cards will get milled, which then in turn will generate you even more spawn tokens, and it sets up for some sort of a near infinite loop. Pretty crazy value for just a 2-drop creature. Sage of Hours. This card has the heroic mechanic, meaning whenever we do target it with a spell, we get to put a counter on it. Now, while this is a pretty hard thing to do in a game of Magic, we can easily get a huge amount of counters on it by just using our Mothman's second ability. And once this card is stacked to the brim with +1/+1 counters, we do get access to its last ability, which is where things get absolutely nuts. On instant speed, we can remove all +1/+1 counters on this creature, and for each 5 counters we did remove this way, we get to take an extra turn after this one. And with the huge amount of counters that our Mothman will generate us, we can use this simple 2-drop creature to chain an infinite amount of turns, and it isn't really all that hard to do so. Even just having one of your mill engines and your Mothman on the battlefield will enable you to use this card's ability, and on the extra turn you can easily get even more milling done, get even more counters, and get even more turns. And just imagine also having a counter doubler like a Hardened Scales or a Winding Constructor on the battlefield, and how easy it is to get to those 5 counters, making this into one of the most reliable and easy to achieve win conditions in the deck. And now that we're on the topic of stacking a huge amount of counters, we're also playing Uroboroid, a 4-mana plant worm that at the beginning of combat will put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, X being Uroboroid's power. Now trust me when I tell you, this card can win the game all by itself, since the amount of counters it places will just grow exponentially, because it also puts counters on itself, growing its power. And if you are able to get a couple of creatures on the battlefield from either your Basking Broodscale or your Undead Alchemist, the value is just insane. And thanks to us playing a commander that allows us to stack counters on our creatures, we can sort of kickstart this process. Just put a couple of counters on your Uroboroid, and on your next turn you will get to distribute even more counters across your entire board. This card is honestly very simple. Either your opponents remove it really quickly, or they will just lose the game against it. Now, due to it being this strong, it does have quite a hefty price tag. If you don't want to spend the money on this card, you can also replace it with an Ozolith the Shattered Spire, which is a 2-mana artifact that functions in exactly exactly the same way as a Hardened Scales, and even has its own activated ability that allows you to stack additional counters. Herd Ballad, a 5 mana creature with a really similar ability as a Basking Brute Scale, but instead of generating these cute Eldrazi spawn tokens whenever any counters are put on it, you now get to generate massive 4/4 beast tokens instead. Now I can guarantee you whenever you do have your Wise Mothman on the battlefield, this card will generate you at least 4 of these beast tokens per turn cycle thanks to the red counters. But once you do have additional mill engines on the battlefield, this card gets absolutely nuts and you can use those massive beast tokens as a win condition. And in exactly the same way as a Basking Brute Scale or an Undead Alchemist, this card also has a nice synergy with Altar of the Brood. Whenever you generate any of these beast tokens, you will get to do more milling, which in turn will generate you even more beasts. And the last card in this section, and you probably could have seen this coming from a mile away, is a Walking Ballista. For double X, we get an artifact creature that will enter the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on itself. And the real banger ability on this card is that we can remove a +1/+1 counter from this creature to ping 1 damage at any target. Now, like I mentioned, thanks to our Mothman, we will be able to get a ridiculous amount of counters on this card, which you can then use as a removal machine. Just ping any creature off the board you don't like, or you can even target your opponents directly and use this as a win condition to just reduce their life total to 0. And there is also a nice little 3-card near infinite combo we can set up with it. You will just need your Wise Mothman, your Walking Ballista, and a Mind Crank on the battlefield. You can then remove a counter from Walking Ballista to ping 1 damage to an opponent. This will then trigger your Mind Crank, making that opponent mill a card. And if the milled card is a non-land permanent, you will get a Mothman trigger, allowing you to put another +1/+1 counter onto your Ballista. And you can then just keep repeating this process for as long as you are milling non-land cards to just ping down an opponent's life total or just mill their entire deck. And if you want to make this combo even more efficient, you can combine it with a counter doubler like your Hardened Scales or Winding Constrictor, which will make it a lot easier to keep the combo going thanks to your Ballista getting 2 counters whenever a non-land card is now milled. Next up, we have the card draw section. Since this deck revolves around building a powerful engine, keeping our hand filled is incredibly important. These cards will help us dig through our deck, find any of our key pieces, while making sure that our engine never runs out of fuel. Flitterwing Nuisance, a new 1-drop 2/2 flying creature we got in the Lorwyn set that will enter the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on itself. And for 3 mana and removing a counter from this creature, we get access to a Coastal Piracy effect that will, whenever any of our creatures do deal combat damage to an opponent, will draw us a card per creature that dealt damage. And since we can remove any sort of counter for this effect, it even works with the +1/+1 counters from our Mothman. Whenever we mill, we can just stack additional +1/+1 counters on this card, and we will easily be able to use this effect over and over again every single turn. The best thing about this card is that it is a flying body itself, meaning that whenever we go for a swing, we can swing with this creature itself and it will draw us an additional card of its effect. Hollow Merc Siege, a 2 mana enchantment that whenever it enters a battlefield will make us choose between one of its 2 modes. Now in this deck, we will always be picking the first mode, Sultai. Whenever a counter is put on a creature you control, you get to draw a card. This effect will only trigger once per turn, and even though this effect might seem a little restricted, we can easily bypass the once per turn mechanic, because with even just the red counters from our Mothman, our opponents will always be milling during each of their turns, which then in turn will generate you up to 4 counters with Mothman over the course of a turn cycle, giving this little 2 mana card the potential to draw you up to 4 extra cards per turn cycle, making this into a really low cost efficient card that will reward us with a massive amount of card draw for just playing the deck like we normally would. Polywog Prodigy. Whenever any opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than this creature's power, we get to draw a card. This card is essentially the blue version of an Esper Sentinel because the amount of cards it will draw for you is just ridiculous. Especially nowadays with everyone playing really efficient low-cost spells like a Farseek, a Feed the Swarm, or even any sort of card draw spell like a Brainstorm. Thanks to our Mothman's counter stacking ability, we can just grow the power of this creature to a huge amount, and we will even get to draw cards whenever any of our opponents are casting some bigger non-creature spells like board wipes or planeswalkers. Generous Patron. Passively, whenever we put a counter on any creature we don't control, we will get to draw a card of it. And this card also has the support 2 mechanic, meaning that whenever it enters the battlefield, we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 2 different creatures. Already having a really good synergy with its passive ability, because whenever it enters, you can just put 2 counters on an opponent's creatures, and you will immediately get to draw 2 cards for just playing a 3 mana creature. And since our commander doesn't state we have to put his counters on a creature we control, we can just start putting them onto our opponent's creatures, and we will get to draw a gazillion cards of our Generous Patron. And this card also enables a really crazy loop with Psychic Corrosion. You just need those 2 cards and your Mothman on the battlefield. Whenever you then mill a non-land card, you get to put a counter on an opposing creature. You will get to draw a card of your Generous Patron. This will then trigger your Psychic Corrosion, making each opponent mill 2 cards, which will then generate you even more counters with your Mothman you can put on opposing creatures. And usually you can then keep repeating this loop until the entire table is milled out, resulting in an instant game win. Ray Fillet, Wave Warrior, a new 3-drop flying creature we got in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle set, and it's honestly one of the best cards in the entire set in my opinion. Whenever any creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals damage to an opponent, you will get to draw a card, making this card function as the flying creature body variant of a Bread for the Hunt, which honestly makes it way more efficient because you get another evasive body you can connect with and get to draw even more cards. Terra Symbiosis, a 3-mana enchantment that functions in a really similar way as a Hollow Merc Siege. Whenever we put any amount of +1/+1 counters on a creature, we get to draw that many cards. This effect will only trigger once per turn. Another card that will essentially allow us to draw up to 4 cards per turn cycle thanks to our Mothman's counter generation and the red counters. But due to the way of how this card is worded, if we are able to put a big number of counters on a creature at once, we do get rewarded with a huge amount of card draw equal to the amount of counters, making it scale really well with effects like Hardened Scales, which will allow us to draw 2 cards. And if you, for example, have an Uroboroid on the battlefield and you get to put 5 counters on a specific creature, you will get to draw 5 cards of its effect. And a card with a really similar effect, albeit a lot more potent, is Danny Pink, a 4-drop creature that will give all creatures you control an additional line of text. Whenever a counter is put onto this creature, you get to draw a card. This effect only triggers once per turn, and this is by far the best draw engine in the entire deck. Because let's say you do have your Mothman on the battlefield and an opponent has to mill 6 cards and 4 of them are non-land cards. If you then also have 4 creatures on the battlefield, you can put a counter on all 4 of those creatures, and Danny Pink will then draw you a massive 4 cards. And keep in mind, you can repeat this during every player's turn. And if you combine this effect with a Psychic Erosion on the battlefield, you can set up for an easy mill game win. Patamage, a 4-drop creature that whenever you put any amount of +1/+1 counters on this card will draw you that many cards. And this is one of the only effects like this in the deck that doesn't have a once per turn restriction, enabling you to draw for each non-land card that is milled with your Mothman on the battlefield, while also usually resulting in an instant game win if you do have your Psychic Corrosion on the battlefield by just milling out your opponents. Petted Gargantua, a card I honestly didn't even know existed before making this video. It just has a common rarity, but the effect is absolutely incredible. Whenever you would put 1 or more +1/+1 counters onto this creature, you get to draw 2 cards for the cost of 2 life, while also having the restriction that it only triggers once per turn. Yeah, the potency on this effect is just incredible. It does come with a life cost, but if you are able to make your opponents mill at least one non-land card during each of their turns, this card will draw you a massive 8 cards per turn cycle, which honestly is just all the card draw you'll ever need. You will never ever run out of cards in your hand when you have this on the battlefield. And the last card in this section is a Disciple of Realize, a 6-mana creature that whenever it enters a battlefield allows you to sacrifice another creature, and then you will get to gain life and draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Now when you combine this with a huge amount of counters we are able to get onto our creatures thanks to our Mothman, it isn't all that unusual to draw like 10 or 15 cards whenever you play your Disciple of Realize, bumping up your life total by a massive amount and allowing you to dig really deep into your deck. And this card is also an MDFC land, meaning that whenever you don't need its effect you can just play the backside, which is a land that taps for a green mana and even enters the battlefield untapped for the low cost of 3 life. Just like any other MDFC card, you should view this as a land first, that whenever you do draw into it into the late game also has an additional effect. If you like these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. Members will get early access to the deck lists, exclusive Discord channels where I share what projects I'm currently working on weeks before the videos even go live, and of course that glorious Panzer helmet next to your name on YouTube. Seeing so many of you decide to directly support the content honestly means the world to me, and it's the main reason I can keep pouring all of my love and passion for Magic into these weekly deck tech videos. Now one last thing before we get back to the deck. If you are building any of my decks and you do need to sleeve them up, you can now save some money by using the code Panzer over on the Dragon Shield website to get a 5% discount. So if you were about to buy sleeves anyway, you might as well save a little bit of money and help your favorite content creator keep on the lights in the studio. An absolute win-win situation if you ask me. Next up we have the support section. These are simply the cards that make the entire deck come together, whether they give us recursion for our important pieces, adding extra utility to the deck, or even giving us alternate ways to win the game. These cards do make the deck a lot more consistent. Bloodchief Ascension. Anytime I include this card in any of my decks, I could honestly ramble on for 10 minutes straight about how broken this card is. It's a 1 mana enchantment that at the beginning of each end step will check if an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn. If they did, you get to put a quest counter on this card. Now no matter whatever deck you are playing, it is really easy to get quest counters. It will trigger whenever your opponents are just swinging at each other, if an opponent pays 2 life to make their shockland enter the battlefield untapped, and especially in this deck it is incredibly easy to trigger thanks to our red counters. Once you have 3 or more quest counters on this card, you unlock its incredibly potent effect. Whenever any card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, they will lose 2 life and you get to gain 2 life, which just over the game will generate an incredible amount of draining. Creatures dying in combat, creatures being removed, or even your opponents cracking fetch lands. Now in any deck that's already some incredible value, but especially in this type of deck with all of the cards we'll be milling, a Bloodchief's Ascension is just a straight up win condition. With your Deep Mug Desperado, each opponent will lose 6 life and you will get to gain 18 life. Whenever opponents have to mill due to their red counters, you will gain 2 life and they will lose 2 life per red counter. If they cast any spell with a memory erosion, it will now cost them 4 life and you will get to gain 4 life. And I'm sure that if you use your imagination, you can think of 10 more cards that just have an incredible synergy with this effect. And Bloodchief's Ascension also enables a 2-card infinite combo when combined with Mindcrank. Whenever any opponent now loses a single point of life, they will have to mill a card to your Mindcrank, which in turn will then trigger your Bloodchief's Ascension, making them lose an additional 2 life, which then will trigger Mindcrank, making them mill again, and the loop then just continues until they either run out of cards or they run out of life. Some pretty busted value for just a 1 mana card, right? Simic Ascendancy, a 2 mana enchantment that whenever you would put any amount of +1/+1 counters on a creature you control will get that many growth counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you do have 20 or more growth counters on this enchantment, you just straight up win the game. Now I can assure you, with our Mothman or things like our Uroboroid, it will be really easy to get to the 20 counter threshold on this card, simply creating some sort of a deck building skill check for your opponents. Because if they didn't include any sort of enchantment removal in their decks, they won't have an answer and they will lose the game to this. Agatha's Soul Cauldron, a 2-mana artifact we can tap to exile any card from any graveyard and then put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control, already giving us a really solid piece of graveyard hate against any sort of Spellslinger or reanimation deck. But the real kicker about this card is that all creatures we control with a +1/+1 counter on them will get all activated abilities of any creature exiled with this card. And since we will easily be able to get counters onto all of our creatures with Mothman's ability, you can do some really crazy things with this card. You can exile your Bloom Tender with this effect and turn all of your creatures into really efficient mana dorks. You can exile your Sage of Hours and essentially give all of your creatures his activated ability to take a ton of extra turns. And probably the best thing you can do is exile your Walking Ballista, which then in turn, whenever you do have a ton of creatures with counters on them on the battlefield, will allow you to just ping down all of your opponents at once. Now obviously a card having this crazy of an ability does come for quite a hefty price. There isn't really any card with a similar effect, but if you do want to make the deck a little more budget friendly, you can replace it with a Scurry Oak, which just like a Herd Ballad or a Basking Brood Scale will generate you creature bodies whenever you put +1/+1 counters on it. Evolution Witness, the mutant version of an Eternal Witness. Whenever you put any amount of +1/+1 counters onto this creature, you get to return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. And thanks to us being able to stack a ton of counters onto this creature in separate instances with our Wise Mothman, this simple card turns into a really crazy recursion engine. You will easily be able to get like 5 triggers of this card per turn cycle and just recur any permanent from your grave to your hand, which is perfect to just get back any of our value cards we milled to our own mill effects like a Mesmeric Orb, or that we milled to our own red counters. Irma, Part-Time Mutant, my personal favorite card we got in the Mutant Ninja Turtle set. A 3-mana creature that at the beginning of combat will turn into a copy of any creature you control, but she will retain her own name, and then she will get a +1/+1 counter. Now the most important part of this ability is the fact that she does retain her own name, which means we can even copy legendary creatures with this effect and they won't die to the legend rule. Usually clone effects that do bypass the legend rule come at a minimum mana cost of 4 mana, making her really efficient. And at the end of turn she doesn't even turn back into a copy of herself, making this into a really versatile effect we can use to get a second copy of any value creature depending on what we need most at the current given board state. You can turn it into a copy of your Deep Muck Desperado and get even more milling in, into a copy of your Polywog Prodigy to just draw a gazillion cards, and obviously you can also turn it into a copy of your commander, which will allow you to get even more red counters on every player and will also give you more triggers whenever you mill a non-land card and put even more counters on any creature. 6. Honestly, just the alt art version of this card is more than enough reason to include it in the deck. Just look at that little blue burb sitting on his finger. It's a 3-mana creature that whenever it attacks will make you mill 3 cards and you can put a land card from amongst those cards back into your hand, giving you an additional mill outlet that will give you Mothman triggers, while also making sure you won't miss any future land drops. And this card putting a land card back into your hand synergizes perfectly with its second ability, that will during your turn will give all non-land permanent cards in your graveyard the retrace mechanic, meaning you can just discard a land card and you will be able to cast those cards straight from your graveyard. Another fantastic recursion tool that will allow you to get back any sort of value engine or value creature that over the course of the game got removed or got milled. Still Explorer, the craziest landfall power creep card we got in recent sets, and that is because it combines 2 of the most potent effects into one single creature, being an exploration allowing us to play an additional land during each of our turns accelerating our mana, and a Crucible of Worlds allowing us to play land cards straight from our graveyard, which will make sure we always have access to lands to play, even the lands we milled over the course of the game or any sort of fetch lands we cracked in the early game, and will enable us to use them again. Now just those 2 abilities alone already make this card incredibly potent, but on top of that that, it also has its own landfall ability. Whenever any of our lands enter, we get to mill a card, synergizing perfectly with its own first two abilities, while also giving us a consistent stream of extra milling that we can convert into +1/+1 counters with our commander. And these kind of potent effects on a single card will cost you quite a bit of money. If you do want a budget alternative, you can play the card from the Duskborn set, Walking Closet and Forgotten Cellar, which the left side will also enable you to play land cards from your graveyard, and the right side is another really solid recursion effect you can use in the late game. Sir Conrad the Grim, a 5-mana creature that whenever any other creature is put into the graveyard from either the battlefield or straight from a library, will make each opponent lose 1 life. Now, while this card isn't as potent as a Bloodchief's Ascension because it only triggers off creatures, it is still a really nice way to convert all of the milling you'll be doing into actual damage. And it's also another card that sets up a near infinite combo with a Mind Crank, because whenever any creature now gets milled, Sir Conrad will deal damage to each opponent. Mind Crank will then cause even more mill, and if amongst the milled cards are any more creatures, the loop just keeps going until you don't mill any creatures anymore. And for 2 mana he has an activated ability that will make each player mill a card, which later in the game is a really excellent dump for all of the excess mana you might have around, resulting in more damage with his passive effect, more counters with your Mothman, and will trigger any other mill synergy we play in the deck. Willbreaker, a really fun pet card I honestly just had to include in the deck. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes a target of any of our abilities, we get to gain control of that creature for as long as we control Willbreaker. And this card goes absolutely nuts with our Mothman's counter ability, because whenever we now mill a non-land card, we get to put a 1/1 counter on any creature our opponents control, and we will simply get to gain control of that creature, enabling us to steal our opponent's commanders or just their biggest threats on the field. Now, while they will get to regain control of their creatures once Willbreaker is removed, as you will see later, we do play a ton of counter magic and protection spells to prevent this card from being destroyed, making it a viable card in the deck. And let's round this section off with what is probably the most well-known Sultai card out there, Muldrotha the Gravetide, a massive 6-mana creature that during each of our turns will allow us to play a land and cast a permanent spell of each type from our graveyard. Later in the game, if a bunch of cards did end up in your graveyard, you can just drop your Muldrotha and you can just start recasting them again. And while Muldrotha is worded in a really weird way, what her ability essentially means is that per turn you will be able to cast 1 creature, 1 artifact, 1 planeswalker, 1 enchantment. Just 1 card per turn for every card type out there. Now, while 6 mana might sound like a pretty big investment, as you will see in the next section, it's really easy for us to get to that amount. Next up, we have our acceleration cards. Getting our Mothman on the battlefield as early as possible is incredibly important, because the sooner we start stacking red counters and we can start our milling process, the faster our board will grow out of control. Birds of Paradise, the classic 1 mana flying mana dork that will tap for 1 mana of any color, enabling us to get our Mothman out as early as turn 3, and later in the game whenever we are able to just get 1 counter on it with our Mothman, can be used as an additional evasive body to connect with to our opponents and draws additional cards of our Ray Fillet or our Flitterwing Nuisance. Sol Ring, even though our commander only has 1 generic mana in its cost, it is still the most efficient acceleration piece in the commander format, which will allow us to get our really big cards out 2 turns earlier and will help us pay for any sort of commander tax if the Wise Mothman is removed. Bloom Tender, a 2 mana creature we can tap to add 1 mana to our pool for each color we control amongst our permanents. Now baseline, since this creature is green, it will always tap for at least 1 mana, which is some pretty solid value. But once you do have your Wise Mothman on the battlefield, it will tap for a massive amount of 3 mana, allowing you to follow up with even more value cards and start pushing towards a win. And a good budget alternative to this card is a Gyre Sage, a simple 2-drop creature you can tap to add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each counter it has on itself. And as you can imagine, with the counter stacking of our commander, the mana this little boyo will produce for us gets out of control really quickly. Arcane Signet, a 2 mana rock we can tap for 1 mana of any color. Another way to get our commander out on turn 3 while also really helping us with our color fixing. And a card with a really similar effect is Hurt Heirloom, which is also a 2 mana artifact you can tap for 1 mana of any color but only for creature spells. And it also has another activated ability you can use on any creature with power 4 or greater, giving it both trample and an additional line of text that says whenever this creature does deal combat damage to an opponent, you get to draw a card. You just need 1 counter on your Mothman, and you can start using this effect to draw 1 additional card per turn you do swing with your Mothman, which is something you will always be doing anyways. Incubation Druid, a 2-drop dork that will produce us 1 mana of any color, and if you are able to get a single counter on it, it will tap for 3 mana instead, giving it Bloom Tender levels of efficiency. Next up, we have 3 simple non-creature spells that will allow us to grab a land for 2 mana, a Nature's Lore, a 3 Visits, and a Farseek. All of these cards will enable us to get our Mothman out on turn 3. They will allow us to fix our colors because we can use these effects to go get either our Triome or our Shocklands, and you can also use these cards to get an additional landfall trigger for your Deepmug Desperado or your Ice Still Explorer. 3 Strider Lookout. Whenever you commit a crime, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library and put 1 land card from amongst them onto the battlefield tapped. This ability will only trigger once per turn, and this is probably one of my favorite cards in the entire deck, since we have such an easy time triggering the crime effect 4 times during a turn cycle with our Mothman's counter ability. The amount of lands this card will grab from your deck straight to the field is just ridiculous. A really underrated card in my opinion. Kami of Whispered Hopes, a 3 mana Hardened Scales attached to a creature body. Whenever we would put any amount of counters on a creature, we will get to put that many +1, already giving us exactly the same benefits as I talked about with Hardened Scales. And on top of that, we can also tap this creature to add X mana to our mana pool of any color, X being the amount of power this creature has, which is just perfect for this deck because we can use our Mothman to stack a huge amount of counters on this card, which mind you will be doubled thanks to its own passive effect, and then we will easily be able to tap this creature for like 10, 15, 20 mana, and we will easily be able to cast every single card in our deck. Kodama of the West Tree, a 3 mana creature that will give all modified creatures you control trample. Modified creatures being things that are either equipped, enchanted, or most importantly have counters on them. This ability will ensure that you are always able to get combat damage through, because even if you do have a 50-50 Mothman on the battlefield and an opponent controls a 1/1 flying spirit token, they can just use it as a chum blocker and no damage will go through. Now while that ability in itself is already really potent in this deck, the real kicker of this card is its second ability. Whenever any modified creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you get to search your library for a basic land card and put it into play tapped. And just like I talked about with Flitterwing Nuisance and Ray Fillet, since we have such an easy time getting our creatures to the modified status, you will easily be able to go fetch all of the basics from your deck to the field, both accelerating your mana and filtering your future draws, making sure you won't draw into any basics in the late game and draw some actual relevant cards. Tato Farmer, by far the ugliest looking chap in the entire deck, a 3 mana creature that on landfall gives you the option to give 2 red counters to yourself, and in this deck you will always want to take that deal, because the more milling we are doing, the more counters we'll produce with our Mothman, the more mill synergies we'll be triggering, and we will easily be able to recur any of the milled cards back to our hand anyways. And the milling this card provides also scales incredibly well with its activated ability, and that is that we can tap it to put target land card that was milled this turn straight onto the battlefield under our control. Now while this is a really solid acceleration tool to just recur any lands you milled and accelerate your mana, you can even use this effect to gain control of any sort of lands that your opponents did mill, enabling you to use their own deck against themselves. And now that we're on the topic of mill-based acceleration, Hatch Shredder, a 4-mana vehicle that whenever any land card would be put into your graveyard from your library, you get to put onto the battlefield tapped instead. And this card is just bananas in this deck, because if you're now milling lands to your red counters or things like your Mesmeric Orb, if amongst those cards are any lands, you now just get them into play, which honestly is just a stupid effect that will make sure you do have a huge amount of lands in play and that you have a ton of resources to work with on your future turns. Now on top of that, you can also crew this vehicle by just tapping any creature with 1 power, which will turn it into a 5/5 body that whenever you swing with it will make you mill 2 cards, triggering its own land recursion effect, while also giving you an additional way to mill and generate even more counters with your Mothman. Next up, we have the protection and the interaction. The longer our Mothman can stay on the battlefield, the more dangerous he becomes. These cards will help us disrupt our opponent's game plans and protect our own value engine so we can't get disrupted. An offer you can't refuse. For just 1 mana, you get to counter target non-creature spell, but in return the controller of that spell will get to generate 2 treasure tokens. A really efficient way to protect any of your value engines and your Mothman from spot removal, or to protect all your creatures from any sort of board wipe. And the fact that you are giving your opponents 2 measly treasure tokens in return for protecting your entire board or to stop their infinite combo from winning the game is never gonna matter in the grand scheme of things. Retribution of the Ancients, a 1-mana enchantment with an activated ability for 1 black mana, which will allow you to remove X +1/+1 counters from amongst creatures you control to give target creature -X/-X until the end of turn. And thanks to the huge amount of counters we'll be stacking with our Mothman, this card is an incredibly potent removal engine. It isn't all that hard in this deck to get like 20 counters spread amongst your creatures, which will then in turn allow you to with this card remove any creature on the battlefield you don't like for just 1 black mana. And you can just keep repeating this effect over and over again, turning it into a really oppressive control tool. Revitalizing Repast, a 1-mana spell that will put a counter on a creature you control and it will give it indestructible until the end of turn. A really efficient way to protect your Mothman, and if you don't need this card's effect, it just functions as a dual colored land that will enter the battlefield tapped. Assassin's Trophy, for 2 mana, on instant speed you get to destroy any permanent on the field. A Smothering Tide, a Krenko, or even any problematic land like a Field of the Dead. In return, the controller of that spell will get to fetch a basic, but just like I mentioned with an offer you can't refuse, that usually doesn't matter, because you will be using this effect to get a really valuable card off the field and just giving a simple basic in return. Cankerbloom, a 2-mana creature that you can pay 1 generic mana and sacrifice to pick 1 out of its 3 options. You get to destroy target artifact, enchantment, or you get to proliferate. The first 2 options both giving you a way to deal with any valuable artifact or enchantment on the field, and you can use the third option to get additional counters. And my favorite part is the fact that proliferate actually works with red counters, increasing the radiation that your opponents have by 1 point. Collective Resistance, a 2-mana spell that will destroy either an artifact, an enchantment, or functions as a great protection tool by giving hexproof and indestructibility to 1 of your creatures. And my favorite part about this card is the fact that it has the escalate mechanic, meaning that whenever you cast it, you can pay 1 green mana up to 2 times, and for every time you did, you do get to pick an additional 1 of its options, giving you some really specific value for 2 mana, or just giving you a huge amount of value for an extra mana investment. Drown in the Loch, for 2 mana you get to either counter target spell or destroy target creature. The only requirement for this card is that the controller of that spell or creature needs cards to be in their graveyard equal or less than the amount of converted converted mana cost of the said card. Now since we are a mill deck, we will always meet the requirements for this card, making it function as both a really efficient counter spell or a removal spell. Heroic Intervention. For 2 mana we get to give every permanent we control both hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. The perfect answer against any sort of spot removal or board wipes, and since it gives both of those keywords to all permanents you control, you can even use it to protect any of your value artifacts like your water crystal from being removed by something like a Vandal Blast. Ripples of Potential. A card that first will proliferate and then phase out any amount of permanents you control that have a counter placed on them this way. Phasing out means that those permanents won't exist until your next upkeep. Another really great way to protect your Mothman or any of your other creatures from being wiped, while also proliferating all of your +1/+1 counters and your rat counters. Repulsive Mutation. For 2 mana plus X you get to put X amount of counters on any creature you control. Then you will get to counter any spell on the stack unless its controller pays X amount of mana, X being the greatest power amongst creatures you do control. Now since 90% of the time we will have a huge Mothman on the battlefield, this card essentially functions as a classic counter spell that also has the additional benefit of allowing us to put X amount of counters on a creature, which has an incredibly nice synergy with things like Terra Symbiosis. Pump 5 mana into the X of this card, and Terra Symbiosis will draw you 5 cards in return. Swift Foot Boots. For 2 mana you get an equipment you can equip for 1 generic mana that will give both haste and hexproof to the equipped creature. Now first up, this is just fantastic to attach to your Mothman and he won't be able to be targeted anymore with spot removal. And if for some reason he does get removed whenever you now recast him from the command zone, you can just pay 1 generic mana, equip him with the boots on its little insect feet, and you will then instantly be able to swing with him and dish out even more rat counters with his attack trigger. Nuclear Fallout. For 2 black mana plus X, each creature on the board will get twice -X, and each player will then also get X rat counters, which is a fantastic tool we can use to just reset the board if we are behind. Usually our Mothman will be big enough thanks to his counters to just survive this effect anyways, and it also gives us a way to dish out an immense amount of rat counters to all players, which will translate in a ton of extra cards having to be milled and triggering all of our mill synergies in this deck. And a really similar and way more efficient board wipe minus the rat counters is a Toxic Deluge, a 3 mana spell that will allow you to pay X life and will then give all creatures on the board -X until the end of turn. And board wipes really don't get any more efficient than this one. If you are playing against a small token player, you can just pay 2 life and wipe their entire board, just ruining their day. And later in the game, if you for example are playing against a dragon player, you can invest a huge amount of life in this card and it will also wipe the entire board, essentially always guaranteeing you a board wipe for just 3 mana depending on the amount of life you have to spend. Bridgeworks Battle. For 3 mana you get to give any creature you control a +2/+2 stat boost and then it will fight any creature on the battlefield. Another spot removal tool to get any creature you don't like off the battlefield, which also can function as a land that can even enter the battlefield untapped. Wave Goodbye. For 4 mana you get to return each creature on the field without any sort of counters back to its owner's hand. And since we have such an easy time getting +1/+1 counters onto all our creatures with our commander, in this deck this card will always function as a one-sided bounce effect, just destroying all of the tempo that your opponent spent the entire game building up and removing all tokens. And the last but my favorite card in this entire section is Glen Elandra Archmage, a 4 mana flying creature that has an activated ability for 1 blue mana that we can sacrifice it to counter target non-creature spell, essentially giving us an offer you can't refuse on a creature body. And this card also has the persist mechanic, meaning whenever it would die it will return to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on itself, which in itself will already enable you to get 2 uses out of this card. But whenever we do combine this card with our Mothman's counter stacking, it turns into a counter engine we can just keep repeating over and over again, because whenever a creature has both a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter on itself, these two will actually cancel each other out. So you can just use this card's effect and sacrifice it to counter a spell. It will then return to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. You then just have to mill mill one non-land card with your Mothman on the battlefield to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you will be able to use its effect again, and it will just return to the battlefield again with the persist mechanic, making it into an auto-inclusion in any sort of Mothman deck. And finally, we have our lands. I did decide to go with a pretty expensive mana base using things like fetch lands, shock lands, the bond lands, but if you want to make the deck more budget friendly, you can easily replace these with any of the scry lands, pain lands, or even the check lands. We're also running a bunch of utility lands, so I'll start by going over those. Bojuka Boch, a land that whenever it enters a battlefield allows us to exile up to one player's graveyard. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, us milling our opponents usually helps them advance their strategy by putting cards with a Harmonize mechanic, Flashback mechanic, Eternalize mechanic straight into their graveyard. And a Bojuka Boch is a simple land that helps us get rid of any of those cards permanently. Buried Ruin, a colorless land we can sacrifice for 2 generic mana to pick any artifact in our graveyard and return it to our hand. A fantastic recursion ability on something as simple as a land that will allow you to return your Altar of the Brood or your water crystal if over the course of the game they either got removed or they got milled. Mariposa Military Base, a land that gives you the option to make it enter the battlefield tapped. When you do, you get 2 red counters, giving us a land that will make us either produce mana instantly or helps us kickstart our own self-mill process. And for 5 mana and tapping this land, we get to draw a card. But the cost of this ability is reduced by 1 generic mana for each red counter we have on ourselves. Usually whenever you get to the later stages of the game, you will have 5 red counters, just enabling you to tap this land without even paying any mana to draw some free cards. Shifting Woodland, a land that will enter the battlefield untapped if you do control a forest, and for 4 mana you can turn this land into a copy of any permanent card you might have in your graveyard, which is just fantastic later in the game to get an additional use of any card that got removed or got milled. You can turn it into a copy of your water crystal, your Altar of the Brood, or even set up some game wins with it by turning it into a copy of your Mind Crank that your opponents just removed. Swarmyard, a land you can tap to regenerate either target rat, spider, squirrel, and most importantly, insect. Since our commander does have the insect typing, it's an additional protection tool you can use to protect them from any sort of destroy effects. And the most expensive land in this entire deck is an Urza Saga, which is an enchantment land that on the turn it comes down will enable you to tap it for 1 colorless mana, the second turn it will generate you an artifact construct token, and the third and final stage will allow you to go tutor up any artifact with mana value 1 or 0 straight from your deck to your hand. In this deck we do have 3 really relevant targets for this effect, the most simple being our Sol Ring as an acceleration piece, our Altar of the Brood to set up for a mill win condition, or even our Walking Ballista to go set up for a combo with that. Now while an Urza Saga is an incredibly powerful land, you don't need it in this deck by any means. If you do want to keep the deck a little more budget friendly, you can just replace it with a basic forest. And for the regular mana producing lands, we're playing 3 fetch lands, 3 of the shock lands, 3 bond lands, 2 horizon lands, a verge land, a survey land, a hidden hideout, a plaza of heroes, a mistrise village, a command tower, a Yavimaya, the Sultai Triome, and for basics we're playing 3 forests, 2 islands, and 1 swamp. And that's it for my in-depth The Wise Mothman deck tech, a commander that slowly forces the table to mill cards and converts all of that mill into a massive board of +1/+1 counters. It's honestly one of the most unique commanders out there. The way he combines mill, counters and radiation into one cohesive game plan is an incredible amount of fun to pilot. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a mod emoji in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the deck tech, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon, because I actually make one of these in-depth videos every single week. Thanks for watching, enjoy spreading your radiation across the table, and I will see you in the next one.